And thank you for coming to today's annual commemoration and public reading of the Essex County Colonial Resolutions of July 9, 1774. They were adopted unanimously on our courthouse green exactly 248 years ago today. We are now having this as an annual ceremony because it's so important that we understand our history, that we celebrate it, that other people know it too. I'm Wright Andrews, president of the Essex Museum and Historical Society, and past president of the local Sons of the American Revolution chapter. SAR, the DAR, the Essex Museum and Historical Society in Tappahannock Main Street are sponsoring this program today to commemorate and honor our forefathers for their actions on these resolutions and a bit more. It's very, very important that our community remember that we live in the heart of really history land from colonial days. This building that we're sitting in was the 1728 courthouse. If we go down Prince Street, you have, among other things, the Ritchie House there. You go down to the bottom of the hill, you have the old Customs House. Come back a ways, turn down Water Lane, you come to what was known for years is the Emerson's Ordinary, and is about to become the 1710 Tavern, I think is the name, and that's a wonderful addition. But there we had George Washington stay, meet with people, stay there a number of times. Go on down a couple of houses, and you see colonial merchants' houses that are on the St. Margaret's campus. We've still got so much of this building. And another amazing thing is that we have so many of our families in Essex County are direct descendants of our colonial patriots. And that's something that we can really, really be proud of. Now, we're going to begin today with an invocation given by Susie Maggart of the Henry Coppolis DAR chapter. And then the Pledge of Allegiance will be led by Michael Rawlings, who is the founding president of our SAR chapter. And I will then highlight the lead up to the resolutions, because it's very important that everyone understand the context in which the resolutions arose and how they were part of a political movement that our forefathers were very involved in. One of the things that amazes me is when you listen to the actual words that they wrote. They did this. They knew what was going on. They didn't have email, telephones, Instagram, Snapchat, all of that stuff. They did remarkable things to form our democracy, ultimately. And, we need to keep that in mind. Again, celebrate it and do what we can to preserve our democracy for our children's children in the future. Now, Susie, could you come up, please, and give us invocation?
Please bow your heads. Eternal God, through whose mighty power our fathers won their liberties of old, we thank you for all your servants who have laid down their lives to defend your gift of freedom. Grant that we and all the people of this land may be ready to follow their examples of courage and loyalty, and may we have your grace to maintain our liberties in righteousness and peace. Amen.
Thank you, Susie. Michael, could you lead us in the pledge, please?
Yes. Please stand. Join in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America with liberty and justice for all. And may I say a word? I would just like to acknowledge Wright for all the work that he did over the last years to resurrect the Essex Resolutions and to make it alive for the county. It's a very powerful document that parallels much of the forgotten history that was happening across the East Coast that led up to the American Revolution. And sometimes we take for granted, or we just give the Twitter 120 characters to the founding of the country. And that really short shrifts everything for us. And it's only through deep research, writing, keeping things alive, and thinking of the sort that Wright has kept alive for us that we're able to really understand how we became who we are as a country. So, Wright, thank you very much. Thank you.
Michael is one of our top historians in the county, and someone who knows and loves history. As I mentioned, to understand the July 9 resolutions of 1774, you have to put that in the context and the lead up to that time. It got started roughly 10 years before the American Revolution, which began in 1775. Great Britain had been at war with half the world, and that was known as Europe's 7 Years' War. And we had the French and Indian War. But when that came to an end in 1763, the British had huge war debts. And just like, I think we're going to have after some of our wars. Naturally, they said, well, let's see where we can raise some money. And look at those colonies. They are, really profiting from us. So let's tax them. They need to pay their fair share. Well, that resulted in the Stamp Act of 1765 that imposed a stamped tax, and you had to put stamps on all types of commercial documents, newspapers, and whatever. Well, people didn't like that. They said, wait a minute, you are taxing us. We didn't say you could. Our House of Burgesses didn't pass that. So in Virginia and elsewhere, you had protest over this hated Stamp Act. And I'll just mention that our area, Essex and across the river, got very involved in the opposition to the Stamp Act. Our local merchant, Ritchie, announced to folks, well, I'm going to comply. And he was the leading merchant in the whole Rappahannock Valley. And other people started to freak and said, look, if Ritchie gives in, we'll never be able to get rid of this thing. So across the river in particular, I think Richard Henry Lee, another great patriot of the area, got people riled up. And they had a big meeting up at Leedstown in which people from Essex County and the counties of the northern neck met, several hundred of them. They talked about the situation. They passed resolution, non-importation resolutions. And then they said, we've got to do more. So the next day, they came on across the river, several hundred of them, came down to Tappahannock, because that's where Archibald Ritchie, was at. And they went to his house. At that time, he was living in the customs house. And after a while, he came out and didn't want to cooperate, but they made it pretty clear to him that if he didn't renounce this, he was sort of toast. Ritchie, being a smart Scottish merchant, decided that he had been wrong, and he changed. He signed a note that, yes, I screwed up, and I'll never do it again. And actually, he didn't. He became a great patriot thereafter. But again, there was a bit of history leading up to all this. That was in 1776. the Stamp Act, I'll just say, was as a result of what we did here and what was done in other colonies. They repealed it in Parliament. Well, that was good. Things seemed to settle down a little bit, but the next thing you know, Parliament, just like our Congress, was busy at it again. And they passed in 1776 the Townshend Acts, which had a number of various restrictions on colonial rights. And again, the colonists here and elsewhere objected to that, protested, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as a result of that, a couple of years later, they were repealed. Then things got better again. Okay, it's not going to be so bad. And what do you know? By 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 73. That imposed a tax on the importation of tea. Now, certainly in those days, the English colonists, they drank their tea the way we drink our coffee in the morning. Or some of us drank our bourbon or wine at night. It was a very, very important thing to them. And Massachusetts residents in particular became enraged. And they did something that we all learned in grade school. They held, dressed as Indians, the Boston Massacre. Not the Boston Massacre, excuse me, the Boston Tea Party. And they threw about 340 odd crates of tea, which were valued at about 10,000 pounds, a huge sum in those days. They threw it in the harbor. Well, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that Parliament got kind of upset about that. And they said those colonists, they've got to be taught a lesson. We can't have this. So they passed another set of laws known as the Intolerable Act. Those laws included a very tough one which closed the port of Boston until reparations were made for all of that tea that was thrown in there. Well, other colonists, when they heard about this, they said, wait a minute, what's happening today to Massachusetts could be happening in any of our colonies, and we have to stand together. We can't let this go unnoticed. So on May 24th, 1774, the Essex House of Burgesses in Williamsburg passed a resolution calling for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer to be held on June 1st in support of Boston. Well, what happens next? The British colonial governor, Lord Dunsmore, said, hey, we can't have that. We can't have the Burgesses passing resolutions like that. That's denying and opposing Parliament's authority. I'm the British government. I will not have that. Bam. Parliament's, the local House of Burgesses is dissolved. Not surprisingly, 3 days later, 89 of the former Burgesses who were still in town did what happens in a lot of cases. They went to a bar to talk things over. And they discussed the situation. They said, we have to keep going. We can't let Dunsmore do this to us. And they passed a resolution calling for non-importation of British goods. They also ultimately sent a letter to all of the various counties in Virginia and asked them to please determine what their local people felt about what was going on in the relations with Britain and what should be done about it. Our own representatives fully supported that, and they called a meeting. That meeting was held here on our courthouse green, July 9, 1774. And that is what we are coming to talk about today, those resolutions. I can tell you that our forefathers that day came up with clear, sweeping, forceful resolutions that our representatives that were to go to a convention, the state convention that was going to be held, known as the First Virginia Revolutionary Convention, they took the resolutions you're about to hear, used those as a basis of what they argued for before the convention. These Essex resolutions were widely circulated. They were printed in the Virginia Gazette, which was the primary newspaper in those days of the colonies. And you know, our voice was really heard. And as you hear this in a minute, again, remember, think about the words. Move yourself back 248 years and think, wow, at least like I do, how could they have come up with such clear things that were really on the cutting edge of what the other colonists, two leading colonists, were thinking? I'll tell you also that, you know, we talk a lot here about Blandfield because we know that's one of the finest old plantations. We're very happy to have it here in Essex County. And we've heard of Robert Beverly. Well, Robert was, you know, a big guy in our county. And so he came to this meeting of hundreds of folks, and he had big sway normally, and he had this idea, well, look, let's just pay the king, you know, a sum of money in lieu of having all these taxes, and then everybody will be happy. And he was assuming, I think, that the big major planners like Beverly would give you the money. Well, turns out that he was out of touch with what our forefathers felt. Instead, our people adopted the Essex resolutions, which are about to be read, and really showed they were with it, and I hope we're as with it today. It was really forward political thinking, and there's no finer statement of Virginia colonists' views than this resolutions. Now, Kevin James will come forward and read us these resolutions. He is representing our colonial forefathers. Kevin? I like your dress, dear. That's pretty cool.
Thank you. First, resolved that we will at all times and on all occasions bear true and faithful allegiance to His Majesty, King George III, and as free men, we have always been and ever shall be willing constitutionally to give and grant liberally our property for the support of His crown and dignity and the preservation of our parent state, but that we can never consent to part with it on any other terms. Second, resolved that the legislature of this colony, for the purpose of internal taxation, is distinct from that of Britain, founded upon the principles of the British Constitution and equal in all respects to the purposes of legislation and taxation within this colony. Third, resolved that the people of this colony in particular and of America in general have a clear and absolute right to dispose of their property by their own consent, expressed by themselves or by their representatives in assembly, and any attempt to tax or take their money from them in any other manner, and all other acts tending to enforce submission to them, is an exertion of power contrary to the natural justice, subversive to the English Constitution, destructive of our charters, and oppressive. Fourth, resolved that the town of Boston in our sister colony of Massachusetts Bay is now suffering in the common cause of North America for the just opposition to such acts, and it is indispensably necessary that all the colonies should unite firmly in defense of our common rights. Fifth, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that an agreement to stop all exports and to all imports from Great Britain and the West Indies, firmly entered into and religiously complied with, will at all times prove a safe and infallible means of securing us against the evils of any unconstitutional and tyrannical acts of Parliament, and may be adopted upon the principles of self-preservation, the great law of nature. Sixth, resolved that the inhabitants of this country will firmly join with the other counties in this colony and the other colonies on this continent, or a majority of them, to stop all exports to and imports from Great Britain and the West Indies, and all other ports of the world except the colonies of North America, if such a measure shall be deemed expedient by the deputies at the General Congress, and whatever agreement the Congress shall come to for the advancing of the common cause of North America, relating to exports, imports, or otherwise, ought to be considered as binding as any act of the legislature, and that we will use our utmost endeavor to support and maintain such general agreement at the expense of our lives and our fortunes. Seventh, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that the several courts in this colony ought not to proceed to the forwarding or trial of civil causes until our exports are opened. Eighth, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that the East India Company, having a desire to monopolize a great part of the American trade to the injury of the other merchants of Britain trading to North America, and knowing well the fatal consequences that must have resulted from their fixing a precedent for future taxes by importing tea into the colonies, became the willing instrument of the ministry to destroy American liberty and deserve the loss they have sustained. Ninth, resolved that we do most heartily concur with our late representatives in their resolve for the disuse of tea, and that we will not hereafter purchase any East India commodities whatsoever. 10th, resolved that the spirited conduct of the town of Boston hath been serviceable to the cause of freedom, all other methods having failed, and that no reparation ought to be made to the East India Company or other assistance for any injury they have sustained, unless it be the express condition on which all our grievances shall be removed. 11th, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that any general censure of the conduct of the town of Boston respecting the tea, without allowing to them the motives of resistance upon the principles of public virtue and necessity, is inimical to American liberty. And we are persuaded that none but ministerial hirelings and professed enemies of American freedom will adopt a language so impolitic, which manifestly tends to create a disunion of sentiment at this time fatal to America. 12th, resolved that the Parliament have no right to pass an act to remove our persons to Great Britain, or any other place whatsoever, to be tried for any offense, and that we are determined not to submit thereto. 13th, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that no merchant in this or any other colony of this continent shall advance the goods now on hand higher than they are at present, or have been for some time, and that the merchants in the several counties sign an agreement to that effect. 14th, resolved that a subscription be set on foot for raising provisions for the poor of Boston, who now suffer by the blockading up of their ports, and that Robert Beverly, John Lee, and Moscow Garnett in St. Anne's Parish, and Archibald Ritchie and John Upshaw in the upper part of South Farnham Parish, and Meriwether Smith and James Edmondson in the lower part thereof, take in subscriptions for that purpose, who are to consign what may be raised to some proper person to be distributed, and that the before mentioned gentlemen are empowered to charter a vessel and send it to Boston. 15th, resolved that this meeting have the deepest sense of the injuries in which the merchants and manufacturers of Great Britain must necessarily be involved by a non-importation resolution, they having placed an almost unlimited confidence in us for a series of years, and by that means have the greatest part of their fortunes lodged in our hands, and that nothing but the desire of preserving our liberties could induce us to adopt a measure big with such melancholy consequences. 16th, resolved that James Edmondson and William Roan, Esquires, the late representatives of this country, be, as they are hereby appointed, deputies to represent us in the general meeting of deputies for the several counties of this colony on the 1st day of August in Williamsburg. And we desire that they will exert their best abilities for the security of our constitutional rights and liberties, and to appoint deputies to meet at the General Congress the deputies of the other colonies on this continent. 17th, resolved that the clerk transmit the foregoing proceedings to the printers to be published in their Gazette. Accordingly, the Essex resolutions were printed in the Virginia Gazette, circulated throughout the colony. As directed by the Essex residents meeting on the courthouse green on August 1st of 1774, Essex burgesses Edmondson and Roan attended the First Virginia Revolutionary Convention, which discussed the county citizens' views. The convention adopted a strong, new non-importation association that, among other things, called for non-importation of British goods, non-exportation of tobacco and other products, non-importation of slaves, merchants not inflating prices to take advantage of shortages, and citizens contributing to the relief of Boston. The Essex July 9th resolutions comported well with what the convention adopted. This convention also selected 7 of Virginia's most prominent leaders to represent the colony in the First Continental Congress that began September 5th, 1775. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and I hope that everyone listened closely, enjoyed what you had to say. There are a lot of footnotes that we could put explaining some of them, but it's pretty clear. And I would say that people were dead on in what they came up with. These resolutions, I think, are quite relevant for us today when we have serious foreign and domestic threats to our American democracy. The resolutions of Essex, 1774, remind us that our colonial forefathers in Essex and elsewhere recognized that they had to be vigilant and actively engaged in the political process to protect their fundamental rights and to take whatever action was necessary to protect them. In closing, Tammy Blackwell, the president of SAR's Rappahannock chapter and our county's revenue commissioner, will tell you what we call the rest of the story. And this involves what happened when Essex leaders did what was called for in the resolution, that being to take a subscription to gather corn to be sent to Boston. Tommy, could you come up and tell us the rest of the story?
Thank you, Wright. The rest of the story. The Essex resolutions called for local residents to donate corn to help feed the people of Boston, many of whom were suffering due to the British blockade of the town's harbor. Our forefathers responded generously and sent a ship loaded with Essex corn off to Massachusetts in September 1774. Here is the response they received from Boston. The following letter was written on behalf of Boston by Samuel Adams, one of America's greatest patriots, to the Essex Committee which sent the corn. To Jonathan Upshaw, the July 9, 1774 meeting clerk who signed the Essex Resolutions, and others, Archibald Ritchie, Jonathan Lee, and Robert Beverly. Boston, 14 March 1775. Gentlemen, I am to acquaint you that immediately after the arrival of the unrighteous and cruel edict for shutting up our harbor, the inhabitants of this town appointed a committee to receive and distribute such donations as our friends were making for the employment and relief of those who would become sufferers thereby. Your letter of the 19th of September last, directed to John Hancock, Esquire, or the overseers of the poor of the town of Boston, was laid before the same committee, enclosing a bill of lading for 1,087 bushels of corn, being part of a very valuable contribution shipped on board the schooner Sally, James Perkins' master, for the sufferers, from our respectable friends in Essex County in Virginia. The schooner was by contrary winds driven to the island of St. Eustatia. Mr. Isaac Van Dam, a reputable merchant of that place, generously took the care of the corn, and having made sale of it, remitted the amount of the proceeds, free of all expense, being 171 pounds 8 pence New York currency, in a bill of exchange drawn on Mr. Isaac Moses of that city, which we doubt not will be duly honored. The committee very gratefully acknowledge their obligations to you, gentlemen, for your trouble in transmitting this charitable donation, and they request that you return their sincere thanks to the benevolent people of your county for their great liberality towards the oppressed inhabitants of this devoted town. This is one among many testimonies afforded to us that the Virginians are warmly disposed to assist their injured brethren and fellow subjects in this place. This consideration has hitherto encouraged our inhabitants to bear indignities with patience, and having the continual approbation of all the colonies, with that of their own minds as being sufferers in the common cause of their country, I am fully persuaded of their resolution, by God's assistance, to persevere in the virtuous struggle, disdaining to purchase an exemption from suffering by tame surrender of any part of the righteous claim of America. May heaven give wisdom and fortitude to each of the colonies, and succeed their unremitted efforts in the establishment of public liberty on an immovable foundation. I am, in behalf of our committee, gentlemen, your affectionate friend and countryman, Samuel Adams. This letter tells the rest of the story, and it illustrates how our forefathers were connected with their counterparts in other colonies and worked together to protect colonists' liberties. Thank you for coming today. While you are in the area, in town, please take time to visit our Essex Museum, which is now open. You can obtain publications in the gift shop that give more details regarding the Essex Resolutions and our Essex forefathers in the colonial and revolutionary eras. I'd also like to add that in a month I'll be traveling to Boston, and I will be taking several copies of the publication that Wright Andrews has so graciously written and put together to distribute in Boston. I'm going to be looking into how I can contact our fellow patriots in that area, but I'm looking forward to sharing this story with our friends in Boston. We will now close with a benediction. Please bow your heads, please. Our Heavenly Father, protect us as we leave this assemblage and travel our separate paths. Please watch over our families and our armed services throughout this world, and guide us to reflect the patriotism of our ancestors until we meet again. Bless our town of Tappahannock, our Essex County, our Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck region, our Commonwealth of Virginia, and our United States of America. Amen.
That ends today's program, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. Howard Reisinger is filming this today. It will be up before long on the museum's new YouTube channel and hopefully elsewhere. So all those people who were rained out today can still catch up with it. I hope you've enjoyed it again. I hope you've learned something. And I hope you look forward to learning a lot more about Essex County history. And thank you again. Good evening or good afternoon.